So good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this class. And I welcome you for today's class. Sorry for yesterday that we couldn't meet. As a way of summarizing what we did last week. Last week, we focused our attention on the topic, the classical and the Keynesian aggregate demand, aggregate supply, equilibrium framework. And that particular topic tries to examine the classicalist ideology of how the aggregate demand framework should look like. Okay, and then, so we discussed last week on that classical and the Keynesian aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. And the Keynesian aggregate demand and the aggregate supply framework has tried to explain critically most of the things we have been doing, okay? How it has been from the onset, from topic one, even from your year one, year two, and then what we are doing now. Okay, so that is what we have tried to build on. And then last week we started by explaining the aggregate demand side from the ISLM framework. We tried to understand those markets that exist. We tried to look at the commodity market. We tried to look at the money market. We brought the two together, and then we were able to derive our aggregate demand model, okay? And we looked at the relationship or the framework between the ISLM as well as the aggregate demand framework. So today, we are going to look at the AS, the aggregate supply framework, all right? Under the aggregate supply framework, there are different approaches that can be used, okay? So I'm going to share my slide, all right, to the beginning of that aggregate supply framework. So under this approach, there are things that we must note, okay? And those things we must note is very important, okay? The first thing is we need to understand the framework itself, okay? The aggregate supply framework. The second thing is we need to understand how to actually derive it. Mathematical derivation in your year 3 is not needed. That is not your level. It is in year 4 that you will derive the aggregate supply curve mathematically. In your year 3, you are expected to derive the aggregate demand curve. That was what we did last week, okay? Equating your demand to be equals to your money demand side. You solve the two, you derive the aggregate demand framework, the equation. In your year 3, deriving the aggregate supply framework, you are not allowed, okay? In year 4, you will be exposed on how to derive the aggregate supply framework. However, in year 3, you need to understand the types of aggregate supply we have. You need to understand the graphical representation of those two types of aggregate supply. You also need to understand the theory behind the derivation. So you need to understand, oh, it is because of A, B, C, and D. That is why we have our aggregate supply. It is because of E, D, and F. That is why we have the shape of our aggregate supply curve to be either vertical, horizontal, or slanted. So you need to understand the theory behind that particular shape derivation. You need to understand the graphical representation of that particular aggregate supply curve. But you don't need the mathematical derivation. This is because at your level, you are not solving the mathematical derivation of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. No, you won't solve it. It is in year 4, your starting point becomes your aggregate supply curve derivation. And then you begin to solve the two together, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and you begin to determine your price level and your output. No, so for your year 3, you are only allowed to know how to solve the ISLM, derive them together to get your aggregate demand. Then you are also expected to know the graphical representation of your aggregate supply and the theoretical underpinning why that is being derived. How? And then you need to understand the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, link the two together, and you begin to understand the policies that you can have under such particular scenario, the policies that you can have under those such particular scenario. So those are the things you are expected to understand at this particular level. So for us to be able to understand the derivation of the aggregate supply curve, you must understand that there are 2 views on the aggregate supply. That is the classical and the Keynesian aggregate supply curves. 2 of them are distinct views and opinions on how the aggregate supply curve should look like. Then we start with the classicalist. So for the classicalist believes that the aggregate supply curve is vertical. All right. You have to understand that the aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between the price of goods and services and output. That's what the aggregate supply curve is showing. The relationship between the prices of goods and services and output. That is why in your ADAS relation, when you draw your AS, okay, the vertical aspect is your price. Your horizontal aspect is your real output. If you draw your IS or your LM, the vertical is your interest rates, the horizontal is your output. But when you draw the ADS, the vertical is your price level, the horizontal is your what? Is your output. Now, they believe that the aggregate supply curve is vertical, and the aggregate supply curve can only be determined at the maximum level of output. That is when we have full employment. Of course, you need to understand all of these words. You have done full employment, unemployment in your year 2. When you talk about the full employment, we are saying that this is the particular stage of the economy at which further increases in aggregate demand does not imply a change in the level of employment. At that point, we see we are in full employment. That does not mean that we don't have unemployment existing. There is, of course, and that is a natural rate of unemployment. But we have the full employment that is what's existing, okay? So the classicalists are of the opinion that economy will always operate at the full employment. And when we talk about the full employment, remember that the classicalists are coming from the assumption of the invisible hand. And they are coming from the assumption of allowing the market forces to determine output allocation and price allocation. Prices with respect to prices of final goods and with respect to prices of input, which is wage. So you must understand that the classicalists are of the assumption that the economy will always operate at full employment. And if economy will always operate at full employment, they are of the opinion that output will always be fixed. And if output is fixed, it implies that output does not depend on the level of price. And that implies again that prices can adjust itself. You need to understand each and every of these statements. From the background of invisible hand to the background of government does not have to interfere, to the background of allow the market forces to allocate prices and goods. That then implies that output is not dependent on prices, and output will always be constant, okay? And a very important question is this: why is it that output will never depend on price level, okay? The answer is because of the internal adjustment mechanism. And what is the internal adjustment mechanism? The internal adjustment mechanism is simply saying that the prices of goods and services, okay? The prices of goods and services, what the internal adjustment mechanism says that the prices of goods and services will always adjust whenever there is a change. That adjustment is linked between the demand for labor, the supply of labor, and the final prices of goods and services. Remember, the aggregate supply is coming from the angle of the real sector, and is coming from the angle of the demand for labor and the supply for labor. So if the aggregate supply is coming from that particular angle, you then need to understand that whenever there are changes in the internal mechanism, which is the wage rate, the demand for labor and supply of labor, the classicalist believes that those internal mechanisms will always adjust itself. And when it adjusts itself, it will not lead to increases in prices. For example, let's start with a proposed increase in wage rate. The classicalists are of the opinion that when wages are high, what happens? The demand for labor is greater than the supply of labor. Cast your mind back to our first physical class that we have, okay? That is very important. They have the opinion that when wage rates increases is high, there is excess demand for labor. And when there is excess demand for labor, when wage rate increases, there is excess supply of labor. And when there is excess supply of labor, people are jostling to do what? Work. What happens? There will be unemployment. And when that unemployment exists, okay, because labor is high, people are unemployed, it is going to be temporary. In the process of time, people will then begin to accept lower wage. And then they have an expectation that this wage is going to decline. And because people are accepting lower wage, what happens? That will become an incentive for the suppliers, the employers, to engage more of those people in production. And as they engage more of those people in production, what happens? Employment rate increases. When employment rate increases, unemployment declines. And as unemployment declines, employment rate has increased. there will be an increase in the level of output momentarily. As that output increases, it floods the market. When it floods the market, remember the Phillips analysis, Phillips curve analysis on wage rates and prices, wage rates, unemployment, inversely related. And that means if wage is inversely related to unemployment, wage is also directly related to the price level. So because of that, when the output floods the market, what happens? Prices will fall. And when prices fall, real wage rate is back to equilibrium. So that means there's an internal mechanism at which the system will always adjust itself to changes in what? Price level. Let me explain again. You must understand that there's a relationship between real wage and price level. Okay, from your production function, your output is a function of what? Capital and labor. In the short run, one factor is fixed, which is capital. Capital is fixed, while labor is variable. And then what that means is that your production cost is largely dependent on your real wage, on your wage bill, because capital is fixed. So your cost of production, C equals WL plus RK, remember your micro, is dependent on your wage, on your wage. So that implies that when wage rate increases, it will translate to increases in price. Look at that scenario. Once wage rate increases, that directly translates to increases in price. Maybe I would do some schematics for you to actually understand what I am saying, okay? That is, remember, your Y is a function of what? Capital and labor. Capital is constant. That means your production is equals to WL plus what? RK. Because capital is constant, all of this is fixed. That means for your cost to increase, what happens? Your wage will have to rise. So your wage, your cost of production is dependent on your wage. Capital is fixed. Once wage rises, your cost increases. When cost increases, it will translate to increases in what? Prices of goods and services. That's it. That means wage and price are directly related. And remember, Philip said wage rate is inversely related to what? Unemployment. Meaning when unemployment is high, wage rate will be low. And when wage rate is high, unemployment will be low. So that means when wage rate is high, okay? That means when wage rate is high, what happens to unemployment? Unemployment will be low. So wage is likened to prices. All right. So having said this, look at this particular scenario. Assuming there is increases in wage rate has increased. Take it to the labor market. What will happen? Supply of labor will be greater than the demand of labor. When supply is greater than demand for labor, momentarily, what happens? Unemployment will increase. When unemployment increases, people will then be willing to work because unemployment is high. There are no jobs. People will voluntarily be willing to accept a lower wage so that they can be engaged. What happens? The wage rates will decline. And when wage rate declines, what then happens? You have output. People begin to demand for labor again. As they are demanding for labor, what will happen? The economy will begin to bounce back. Output will momentarily increase. When output momentarily increases, it will lead to flooding in the market. Goods will be flooded. When goods are flooded, prices will what? Drop. As prices drop, remember Phillips curve, price and wage are directly related. As prices drops, what happens? Wage will decline. Look at it. The starting point, wage increased. The end point, wage declines. The final conclusion, the economy is back to the normal position. And what's the final? That is why the aggregate supply curve is what? Is constant and is not dependent on what? Is not dependent on the level of what? Of prices. Okay? Okay. So it's not dependent on the level of what? Of prices. Okay? So all right. So the classicalists are of the opinion that what? The aggregate supply curve is vertical, meaning it is not dependent on price level. And that means that prices is not effective in stimulating the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. That means the supply curve is independent of prices. And that implies that the supply curve is vertical. And that implies that that supply curve is the long-run supply curve, which is similar to the production possibility curve of an economy. That PPC, once the person is producing at that line, you are in your long run. And that implies that the output produced there, defined by the aggregate supply curve, is your what? Your long run. That is the classicalist. You need to understand that. But let's look at the Keynesians. The Keynesians does not believe that such economy exists. In fact, they don't believe. And the Keynesians believe that there is a lot of imperfection in the market. There is a lot of what? Imperfection in the market. Okay? So the Keynesians believe that, you know, what classicalists are saying concerning the aggregate supply curve is not tenable. All right? That part of the assumption of the classicalists is that the economy is in a perfectly competitive labor market and highly flexible wages. You can see from my analysis at that first point that wages started by increasing. And because of that internal mechanism that is in the labor supply, in the labor market, wages had to come back to decline. That means wages are flexible. This is the point of divergence between the classicalists and the Keynesian. And these have stayed for over hundreds of years, about 100 years. That is just the major disagreement between the two. And because of that, so many theories have erupted. So the classicalists are of the opinion that wages are flexible. The labor market will adjust instantaneously to full employment equilibrium whenever there's a discrepancy between labor demand and labor supply. Just like I have explained in that particular slide that I used to show. Keynes does not believe so, and Keynes believes that wages are rigid, especially downward adjustment, meaning wages does not easily adjust downwards. Tó bá ti lọ sókè, kò lè wálẹ̀ mọ́ o. That is what the Keynesians are of the opinion. Why? 3 reasons. Keynes believes, they believe that the labor market is imperfect because of labor unions. And that's true. Because what classicalists are saying is, I beg, you don't need to have ASU. You don't need to have Nigerian Labour Congress. Don't have any of those people. Let there be an adjustment. As there is a misadjustment in the market, what will happen? It will be solving itself. And just like the banking industry, you see, in the banking industry, they don't have union. And that is why they can sack people and they will not employ people back. And when they sack you, they sack you. Because there is no union. But Keynes said no, that the labor market is imperfect and can never be perfectly competitive. And because of that, our wages that we determine, our wages we choose based on contracts, it doesn't vary during the period of changes in labor demand or changes in labor supply. Meaning, I am an ASU member, I have signed a contract with federal government, they've given me wage. This is our salary. When now more people are entering the labor market, more graduates are entering the labor market, it is not dependent on it. Some of our parents are, even in the bank, in oil company, because we are having more graduates that are unemployed, creating excess supply of labor in the market, does not mean they will not start charging me, they will not start paying me low price. It's a lie. They will not. They won't pay me low price. Okay? You discover in that scenario that once I am being employed, once I'm employed, I am employed. And my wage, my contractual wage agreement is determined, and I will be paid. My labor, my wage rate can only come down if my productivity declines. My labor wage, my wage they are paying me will not come down because excess demand is occurring in the labor market. It will not come down because there is excess supply in the labor market. It will not. So a bank, we might have to sack, or if an organization might have to sack a staff only if the productivity of the staff is low. It has nothing to do with what is happening in the labor market. And so the labor market is not perfectly competitive because labor unions are playing a critical role. And as such, contractual wages do not vary during the period of contracts following the change in labor demand or supply. So it doesn't. Number 2 is that most times workers are interested in their absolute wage and also their relative wages. If you have been taught under your consumption hypothesis, remember the relative income hypothesis, saying your consumption is not dependent on your absolute income, but is dependent on the average average income on the social class you belong to. In that same vein, the Keynesians believe that workers are also interested in their relative wages. I must be interested also in how much is my neighbor earning? How much is someone in my position earning in other schools? That is it. A banker in Access Bank will always also be interested in the salary of the banker in First Bank or GT Bank. So when people are bargaining for wage, both the employers and the union, they understand that there's a need to have a relative parity in wage rate structure. Meaning you are doing similar work, you must also have similar wage. Check the banking industry. As many that are in that same bank, the same top tier banks, their salary is similarly the same. They are the same. They hover around it. So there must be a need to have the same wage rate structure. So because poverty has entered the country, or because many people are looking for jobs, that does not mean a banker that they are paying 260,000 before, they will not start saying because demand is excess supply of labor, you are going to decline your wage. That makes the wage rate to be rigid. Okay? The third one is that although there are some segments that we don't have labor union, but you have that intrinsic understanding between the labor and employers that once you fix your wage, you don't have to cut down your wage when there's a sudden decline in the demand for labor. You don't do that. There's an understanding. So even if, that's why if you check banks, look at a bank during lockdown last year, Access Bank, you discover that they found out that, okay, there are no services as at then, which is quite understandable. And then the MD decided to cut down on their what? On the number of staff they have. Okay? Those things were occurring because there was no production in their bank. There was no services. Banks did not open. Services were not rendered. Those things did not occur because there's a change in the structure between excess demand for labor or excess supply for labor. So, Keynes believes that when there's a downward movement in wages, it will always be resisted by workers. And again, upward movement in wages will always be resisted by employers. In summary, Keynes are saying that wage is fixed. Wage is fixed. You need to understand that. That is the summary. Wage is fixed. It is not flexible. It is rigid. If that is the case, what that means is that whenever you have, you remembered, let me check. You remembered what I shared initially. Let me bring it out. Just 1 minute so I can bring it out. Okay. So this is it. Okay. So the Keynesian is saying that this wage increasing and adjustments occur in the demand and supply of labor, blah, 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 and go back to wage decline does not exist. So it is always, I no go agree, I go agree, I no go agree, I go agree, I no go agree, I go agree. Employers will not want to increase wage. The employees will not want to accept a lower wage. What happens? The wage becomes what? Rigid. If that is the case, what that implies, okay, is that the supply and the demand of labor does not affect the aggregate supply curve. And as such, they are of the opinion that the aggregate supply curve is what? Is horizontal. That is their opinion because of this rigidity. In essence, we now have these two particular people. Remember, following Phillips' analysis, and following the direct link between wage and output, wage and price level. Since wage is rigid, it therefore means that prices will also be what? Rigid. And that is why the Keynesian aggregate supply curve is what? Horizontal. While the classicalist aggregate supply curve is what? Vertical. This is the point of divergence of most of classical theories and that of Keynesian. This particular assumption has created divergence. The next question now is, in reality, you can't always have a aggregate supply curve of this nature, these two. In reality, you can't. For theoretical purposes, classical aggregate supply curve will always exist. That is the long run aggregate supply curve. And Keynes have rightly said that we don't need to wait until we get to the long run, because in the long run, we are all dead. So there will always be an aggregate supply curve that is upward sloping, upward sloping, upward sloping, upward sloping. That aggregate supply curve will be upward sloping. Remember, since Keynes is of the opinion that you can't come here and tell me that wages are adjusting, wage does not adjust, wage is rigid and does not change. Your level of employment, all right, or you being retained in a job will be dependent on your marginal productivity of labor. And remember, from your micro, you know, I told you, you don't read or study economics in isolation. You don't do micro and cram and you pour it down. Wow, what is your micro? Next, macro, cram. No, they are linked. They are interlinked. So you don't read one and leave the other. Remember your micro when we discuss production function, the output production function. And we talked about, remember, that Cobb-Douglas, you will do dy dk. That gives you marginal productivity of capital. You do dy dl. That gives you marginal productivity of labor. Okay? You remember, in that function, when you have a function where y is a function of what? A, K, L. We assume A, technological progress, is fixed. Capital in the short run does not change. It is labor that actually does what? Changes. Okay? To increase output. Now, Keynes is saying that wage is fixed. So if wage is fixed, the only thing that can change your output is when there is an increase in your marginal productivity of labor. So an increase in marginal productivity of labor is a major determinant of your output, and that will now link it to your price. What does that imply? When your marginal productivity of labor increases, okay, what will happen? Your marginal revenue product of labor will increase. Let me not assume you know what I'm saying, because let me share something so I wouldn't assume you know what I'm saying. Okay. Look at this. Y is a function of K and L. I'm taking out your A, okay, which is your technological progress. I'm taking it out. So Y is a function of K and L. K does not change in the short run, because once K starts changing, we are dealing with development economics. That's development economics. Now L changes. Now What will determine me employing more person? If you remember, in your microeconomics, when you did demand for labor and supply of labor, in micro, you say a firm should keep employing until that point where is wage rate, okay, is equals to marginal revenue product of labor. Remember, you have been taught. And this marginal revenue product of labor is what? Is equals to marginal product of labor times marginal revenue. If you assume prices are not changing, that means marginal product of labor times price. So wage, all right, will be equals to marginal product of labor times price. Okay. Keynes said wage is rigid. It does not change. All right. We agree. However, when your marginal productivity of labor increases, what happens? Your output will increase based on this particular what? Relation. And your marginal productivity of labor is saying what? What is the extra output that I will get when I increase 1 unit of what? Labor. So if I increase 1 unit of labor, that will impact on my output via the marginal productivity of labor. And then when my marginal productivity of labor increases, because wage is constant, the marginal revenue product of labor will increase as well as prices. And that will then lead to increase in what? Output. That means in a nutshell, okay, when labor increases, marginal productivity of labor increases, and when marginal productivity of labor increases, your marginal productivity of labor times price will also what? Increase. Okay, will also increase. And when that also increases, okay, what will then happen? Your output will increase. And once labor increases, what happens? Your level of employment does what? Increase. In that case, there will always be a positive relationship between prices and what? Output. And that is why your aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. You have output and price. This aggregate supply curve is the short run aggregate supply curve. The long run aggregate supply curve is the classicalist assumption that says that aggregate supply is what? Constant. That in the long run, prices will adjust. So these are the two aggregate supply curves we have. When you are dealing with a short-run analysis, you concentrate on the short-run aggregate supply curve. While if you are dealing with a long analysis, you concentrate on the long-run aggregate supply curve. The logic is this. In the short run, your output will be adjusting. That is your actual output. Can only adjust to your potential output. Your potential output is your long-run aggregate supply curve, which is that one that is at full employment, which is the one that is opened by the classicalists, which is the one that does not depend on prices. So that means in the short run, there can be price adjustments, okay? But in the long run, there won't be, okay? That is the two Okay, that's the two aggregate supply curve that we have. All right. So look at what I was explaining. You see the graph. At first, wage is fixed. Okay. And then that wage that is fixed is equal to your marginal productivity of what? Labor, which is defined as your what? As your supply for labor, as your supply for labor. If you actually did your micro very well, you read it. So when there are increases in price levels, look at it. The level of employment will keep adjusting. And as the level of employment is adjusting from this point, from this point to this point to this point, employment is adjusting. More labor is employed. Okay, prices are going up. Then that will result into what? A positive relationship between your demand, your output, as well as what? Your supply, your prices. And that is characterized by this normal production function. If you remember, your Y is a function of K and L. This production function, this one is micro. All these two things are microeconomics. You are just aggregating them to form the macroeconomic what? Relation. So that means that increases in price level will lead to an increase in money wage. And that increases your marginal productivity times your price, which is your marginal revenue product of labor. And that increases employment as well as a rise in what? Output. So that is the derivation of the what? Aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply that now looks like this. The short aggregate supply that now looks like this, like this one, this particular curve. Okay, we'll get there. So I will pause now to see if